Hi, good morning, everyone. As Gwen said, I'm Feneba Addo. I am I'm an associate professor of public policy at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm also an affiliate of the Cook Center, and I'm also an alum of the DITE program, cohort 10. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Madeline? Oh, there we go. Okay. So as part of the Pandemic Divide book, I co-authored a chapter with Adam, who we just saw, on housing, student debt, and labor market inequality. And I feel like there's a shift from yesterday. We were talking a lot about the health impacts or the health impacts of the pandemic. Today we're kind of looking at economic fallout or the economic of the pandemic. This morning, I'm going to focus more specifically. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to talk about housing or the labor market, but you'll see how it kind of seeps in throughout my talk, but really with a focus on student debt. I was asked to talk about student debt, especially since this morning we're focused on higher education. So in November of 2015, the New York Times published this op-ed on student loan debt that focused on the plight of many college graduates. One of the people featured was Liz Kelly. She was a college graduate, mother of four, a high school teacher who owed a whopping $410,000 in federal student loans. In 2017, USA Today profiled another woman, Melissa Cephalou, and her husband, Andrew. They were two white-collar professionals saddled with $365,000 in debt. And then we also see a lot of different other newspapers, such as the Chicago Sun-Times, USA Today, focusing on these couples with, or couples or individuals with exorbitant, six-figure amounts of debt. And then, and their struggles with trying to pay it off and try to, become homeowners or, save for retirement. And these stories are quite powerful. Like there's no surprise why these were covered by the media, and they indicate a lot of economic pain that these individuals were going through. However, they tend to misrepresent the burden of debt and its implications for current and former students in this country. So one of the things that experts who have studied student loan debt will say that these examples of young adults are not really representative or indicative of the student loan debt crisis. So what am I talking about? First, they would say that student loan debt figures are not, that those figures aren't representative, as I said. There are very few students who have those really high six-figure debt amounts. They would also note that those who have those high amounts usually don't have difficulty paying them off. Why is this? Because those tend to be people who went on for graduate work or professional degrees, such as doctors and lawyers, and they accumulated much of that debt in graduate school. And their occupations allow them to pay them off. But in fact, the people who are more likely to default are those who have relatively small amounts, so about $1,000 or $2,000 amount of debt. Experts would point out that all the people profiled are four-year college graduates or more, right? They have graduate degrees, and who also tend to struggle less. What they usually or didn't recognize when we first started doing this work is that the young adults that were profiled in a lot of these articles were all white Americans. So there was a BuzzFeed article that had a story that more accurately, or we thought, reflected the empirical and racial reality of student loan debt in the United States. One woman profiled, her name was Jen, had $50,000 in debt and is now on an income-based repayment plan after struggling to repay her loans. The $50,000 is still higher than the national average, but research shows, and some of the work that I've done, that black borrowers are more deeply indebted than their white counterparts, which was alluded to in the previous panel. And in addition to accumulating more debt, Jen, like many other borrowers, struggled to repay her debt, and she had defaulted. So racial disparities in student loan default are quite massive. And black college graduates are more than 5 times likely to default on their loans in the decade following graduation than white college graduates. So these stark disparities in student loan debt accumulation and repayment make it clear that race and racial inequality are central to understanding the student loan debt landscape in the United States. and that any discussion of student loan debt that fails to consider race is missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. So so that was my slide about the shift towards kind of focusing on Black borrowers in the student loan debt discussion. So those first few paragraphs are those first set that I just read are the first paragraphs of my book, which Gwen alluded to, which will be officially published in about 2 weeks, and is co-authored with my friend and colleague Jason Houle. He's a sociologist at Dartmouth College. And the book is a culmination of work that we've explored over about 10 years, and that we've done together and both separately on this topic. So at the time, when we first started, our goal was to understand what led Black young adults to accumulate more debt than white counterparts. And what we found was that by age 25, Black college-going young adults reported nearly double the amount of debt. And if we think about that, what does that mean? That the average white borrower if they owe about $22,000, we would expect a comparable Black young adult to own about, close to $43,000 or close to $44,000, which is what this graph is showing. Let me see if I can, is this the next one? Let me see. Yeah. These are tables from the book, and they just are showing the breakdown that we did from our own analysis that shows the overall debt disparity, racial debt disparity, using our data, our nationally representative data of early millennials. And soon the questions that we started to ask, kind of multiplied. And one of the most important questions was whether all of this debt that they were accumulating, was it actually paying off for these students? Because as many may have known, is that traditionally student debt was thought of as good debt, right? It was something that you took on that leads to a college degree and a lifetime of social and economic benefits that are supposed to accompany it. And so to understand that, we had to turn to what happened after college, when young people left school and joined the labor force and began to trying to repay those debts. However, we quickly realized, we are both quantitative social scientists, that the data allowed us to only go but so far. And what we really needed to do was to take some time and speak with people, speak with the borrowers, and the former students, the graduates, the victims of predatory, as we call predatory credit markets. So over the spring, summer, and fall of 2019, we interviewed nearly 50 Black borrowers, Black student loan borrowers, all of whom attended four-year college and universities. We have reasons we can explain that later if you want to know why, but really to try to get at the causes and consequences of student loan debt, and as well as, and bring together much of, as I said, of our published and unpublished research. So, as I said, the introduction for my book is what I just started off with, which was this discrepancy in the coverage of the student loan crisis by race. In chapter 1, we summarize what we know and what we didn't know about Black-white disparities in student debt accumulation and repayment. We also introduce our interview respondents and make the case that student loan debt is racialized, which is also from a report that I published several years ago. In chapter 2 and 3, we focus on debt accumulation, how and why Black students accumulate more debt in the pursuit of a college education than their white peers. And then in chapter 3, we center on how students progress through college and how the hardships that they experience and the types of colleges that they attend leave many Black students with no choice but to borrow and keep borrowing in order to stay and complete their degrees. We then turn to the debt repayment portion of this process and tell the stories of Black young adults after they leave college and start repaying their loans. And we consider the consequences of student debt for their economic, psychological, and social well-being, and show how student loan debt has made the transition to adulthood a little bit more fragile and precarious for Black youth. And the 6th chapter, which I've highlighted there, so we explore the consequences of rising student loan debt for intergenerational inequality. And in the final chapter, we offer up what can be done. So we offer a brief synopsis of policy-based solutions to address the crisis. So one of the things that happened, so as I said, we completed our interviews in the winter of 2019, and then you know what happened, what came afterwards. And so we actually fielded a survey of our respondents in the spring of 2020, and we have a COVID afterward. So the focus of the book, while it's not on COVID, we do have this COVID afterward and the survey data of many of our respondents, and trying to look and assess how they were navigating the new landscape of with the COVID pandemic and repaying their loans. So for this morning, I'm just going to focus on two chapters, or little snippets from two of the chapters that are highlighted. One is Off to College, Into the Red, and then the sixth chapter, Student Debt and the Reproduction of the Fragile Black Middle Class. And I'll conclude with that kind of looking at the COVID, the COVID response, or what happened with COVID. So chapter 2, as I said, begins with the acceptance of college, acceptance into college, and focuses on how students and their families navigate the transition to college and fund the first year. We ask how longstanding racial inequalities in parental wealth, education, and income exacerbate Black students' need to borrow for college and complicate their transitions. So as of 2019, the median net worth of white households was about $188,000, compared with $22,000 for Black households, or 7 times as much. And so we found within our data similar disparities using the data from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. But even more so than education or income, familial wealth is an important resource that drives racial disparities in student debt accumulation. Most obviously, we see that wealthier white families can tap into their savings or investment assets to help pay for college and give money to their children to fund their education. We see here in this table that white families have substantially more financial assets or savings than Black families, and contributed on average about $12,000 to their children over the course of their college career, whereas Black families contributed approximately about $4,200. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that Black parents do not financially support their children. And in fact, research done by actually scholars or affiliates of the Koch Center have found that despite having fewer resources, Black families are more likely to provide financial support for higher education, even if they lack the wealth limits, even if they lack the wealth, and it limits their ability to contribute as much as they would like to. So in some of our earliest work, we show that family wealth is a particularly important resource that is driving racial disparities in debt. And we ask whether parental wealth was associated with lower debt loads for young adult college goers. So not surprisingly, we see what you might expect. As parental wealth increases, debt decreases amongst the young adults. However, when we disaggregate by wealth, we find that parental wealth was strongly associated with reduced debt loads among white young adults, but wealth had almost no effect on student debt among Black young adults. So this is kind of what happens when we disaggregate the relationship. Not only are white families wealthier than Black families, but they can more easily use their wealth to reduce their children's debt, which further fuels the debt disparity. We think that this work is important because it highlights that Black families are less able to use their wealth to protect their children from a student debt burden. It's also suggestive that patterns of racial wealth inequality are being replicated by student debt. One of the things that came out that Jason and I referred to is something we called all hands on deck. So many of the people we talked to credit their extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, with providing them with a financial boost when they get to college. Here, Daniel acknowledged his aunt for helping him pay for unseen expenses in college when his parents could not help. Mom and dad were just always there, he says, but my aunt committed to what she called the aunt scholarship. She paid for my books every semester as long as I kept my GPA at a certain level. That was out of the kindness of her heart, which was a super duper big help. Others received substantial financial help from their grandparents, including Charity, whose grandparents paid for her rent during her first semester in college when her financial aid and student loans were not enough to cover her living expenses. And for Agnes, here it was truly an all-hands-on-deck situation. Parents, aunts, uncles, siblings, and grandparents. She says, freshman year, everybody helped in terms of extra money that I needed. Informal financial support from extended family is more common among Black families than white families, and it both reflects and can exacerbate racial wealth disparities. So for cash-strapped families, getting help from extended family members is a necessary strategy to pay for college, but it comes at a cost. Financial transfers sap grandparents, aunts, and uncles of their financial resources and diminishes their wealth. For Daniel, Agnes, Charity, and others, this means that the money they counted on in their first year of college may also not be available to them as they progress through college. And this is something that we return to in the chapter that follows. Kellyanne, she actually feels grateful and more than a little guilty. So another theme that comes up is how parents helped by taking on loans for themselves. And Kellyanne, as I said, she felt grateful and a little guilty that her mom took on so much debt for her to attend college. She says, she told me, she said that she did not want me to have to take on all that debt. So she was going to take it on for me. And so that was what all about it. Sorry, that was what it was all about. I was really grateful, but I also knew that that was kind of ridiculous about how much debt I hadn't taken on in the name of my education. By the end of her college career at a regional college in the South, she said she had around $42,000 in student debt to pay back. A high number, but again, it's on par with the average amount for Black students. At that same time, her mom had racked up nearly $100,000 in Parent Plus loans to help her cover her tuition, room and board, and other expenses not covered by Kellyanne's financial aid or loans. So unlike the federal undergraduate loans, there are no limits on PLUS loans, which means that parents can go deeper into debt than their children. And here, Alexandria had a similar story when she was at college. She says, during my college career, I took out like $20,000, and then the loans that my parents took out, I don't know the exact number, but I think it was closer to $80,000 or $90,000. So we say that Black parents are the hidden face of the student debt crisis. Decades of research, including our own, demonstrate how Black students take on substantially more debt, but far less attention has been paid to the parents of these students who themselves go into debt to fund their children's college. And we also say that Black parents have been disproportionately burdened by the growth of the PLUS loans and are more likely than white parents to borrow to pay for their children's education. So other studies have found that Black parents, especially those with low and moderate incomes, were more likely to borrow than their white counterparts. And Black families then become in this vicious intergenerational cycle, right? Because financial aid underestimates the financial need and fails to consider their lack of wealth. They go deeper into debt and to send their children to college, which further diminishes their wealth. So here, Sophia thinks about this a lot. She says she is thankful that her parents took on loans to help her pay for college, but these days she finds herself worrying about how debt is going to affect them moving forward. There's no sugarcoating it. I think the debt is the main reason why they're not going to be retiring as early as they would like to. They're approaching their 60s, and they'd like to retire by 65, but that's impossible. It's not going to happen unless we won the lottery. Retirement without any savings or very minimal savings is not possible for them. She paused. For me, my goal is to be able to help them pay that back. They don't expect it from me. I'm hoping that, I'm hoping for that because where I'm hoping to go with my career, I can pay them back. Okay. So those are just a few snippets of the kind of accumulation side of the story. So I'm going to shift now to, as I said, chapter 6, where we focus specifically on the racial wealth gap and argue that while higher education is often thought of as this engine of upward mobility and a ticket to the middle class, the student debt crisis has made the fragile Black middle class even more fragile. So when we spoke to these borrowers, many of them knew that the opportunity cost associated with debt repayment was high, right? So as Yasmin here says, she's a 32-year-old community college and 4-year college graduate, says, I would have more disposable income if I didn't have the debt. My net worth would be plus $17,000 right now if I didn't have the debt. So in the abstract sense, it has impacted it. And every month, every dollar that I put toward the debt is less money that I can save or invest in something. She's right. All else equal, by age 30, having student debt is associated with lower net worth, financial and non-financial assets compared to those without debt. If Black borrowers like Yasmin are paying down their debts while their counterparts without debt are purchasing homes and saving for retirement, then it's unlikely that they will be able to catch up or surpass them. And for those who are falling behind on their loan payments like Yasmin, which she was, their ability to save for the future and accumulate wealth is further hampered. In this way, racialized student loan debt disparities that emerge in young adult can exacerbate, as I said, racial wealth inequalities. This section this was a reoccurring theme that also came up among the people that were interviewed. I want to buy a house, but I don't think it's in the cards right now because I'm too much in debt. So this kind of delay, pushing things back, from young adulthood to later adulthood. Jaden, a 30-year-old college graduate who came from a middle-class background, doesn't even know where to begin. He feels like he can't plan for his future, let alone make big decisions like buying a house until he pays off his debt. It had made him start to question his ability to attain his goals. I think it's made me feel hesitant to want to make big financial steps in terms of like purchasing a house or starting a family. He said, knowing that I have these monthly payments looming and how much they are, it's been challenging to figure out how exactly I could begin to think about affording a house with these loans. That's one thing that's been really challenging. Jaden's hesitancy was a common refrain among our interview respondents. Here he explains how his student debt not only made it hard for him to save for buying a house, but it makes it nearly impossible to plan for a future where wealth is a possibility. If you're not able to conceive of how to achieve a particular financial goalpost, then the realization of that goal became less feasible. While several respondents talk about how student debt hampered their dreams of home ownership, others spoke about adjusting their dreams and goals for the future. Jared, a 31-year-old graduate, lightly joked that he would be downgrading his future desires and settle for a lesser alternative. I'd like to have a lot more savings. I'd say I'm doing pretty well. But had I not had student loans or had they been forgiven or something, I'd have a better car. I'd probably have a bigger house or more children, things of that nature. But I'd say I pretty much probably live the same. I don't need to have a Maserati or anything like that, but just to have the option to have that stuff is what I would be looking for. And it was not because Jared felt undeserving or his preferences had changed, but that student debt had rendered the option of setting such lofty goals out of reach. He settled for less. Jared's hopes for a nicer car or a bigger home might seem trivial in comparison to Jaden's struggles to purchase a home. But the point is that the cuts from these debts are sometimes deep and sometimes superficial. Either way, it still cuts. Our society tells children to dream big, but for Black children, the messages are, you're dreaming too big, or you have to be more realistic. Our respondents' stories highlight the economic burdens of student debt for short and long-term financial security. The stories vary in severity. For some, student debt means they will not get their dream car. For others, it makes them feel like they'll never be able to buy a home or start their families. And for those struggling the most, it cuts off opportunities, access to credit, and plunges them deeper into debt. Unlike many of their white peers, they could not rely on inheritances to improve their financial status and prayed for debt cancellation. So again, this is in 2019, okay? So kind of, where are we sitting? So their stories reflect vast racial disparities in debt, which I've alluded to, that have persisted across generations. But racial wealth disparities also increase within generations because wealth begets wealth. So here, in this figure, we see that over the course of young adulthood, we have a disparity of around $22,000 at age 25 that doubles to more than $56,000 by age 30. So Black college goers were essentially stuck in the amount of wealth that they had, barely increasing between that 5-year age gap, whereas the white wealth more than doubled. We know that social scientists, many who are in this room, have long studied the origins and reproductions of the racial wealth gap and have argued that the wealth gap represents the sedimentation of centuries of systemic inequalities and vicious racist policies, from the institution of slavery through redlining, practices that denied Black people access to home ownership, Jim Crow, and racial segregation. But when we saw the data on rising student loan debt among Black youth, we wondered whether rising debt may explain part of the story among recent cohorts of young adults. That is, does student debt help us to understand the racial wealth gaps that exist among college-going households? In another paper, we tried to answer this question, right? So we found data, and we found that the racial disparities in student debt accounted for around 13% of the racial wealth gap at age 25. In other words, if we could somehow remove that debt, snap our fingers and remove that debt disparity and make the Black debt make it equivalent to the white debt, then the racial wealth gap among college-going young adults would fall by about 13%. So as the student loan debt crisis gained national attention, the topic figured prominently during the presidential election, given its salience with young adult voters. They were really trying to increase access, turnout among young adult voters. This led many candidates vying for the Democratic nomination to center student debt-focused policy prescriptions in their campaign agendas, with many proposals, including some form of student debt forgiveness or cancellation. So here is just a kind of a summarization of some of the policy proposals or campaign proposals. We have Bernie Sanders' plan included total debt forgiveness of the outstanding $1.6 trillion debt, a cap on interest rates, an expansion of the Pell Grant program to include books, housings, and transportation fees. He also wanted students at trade or apprenticeship programs to not be charged tuition, and funding would be increased for HBCUs, tribal colleges and universities, and other minority-serving institutions. It was also the only plan to address these institutions specifically. Senator Warren's plan sought to eliminate about 95% of borrowers by canceling debt up to $50,000, $50,000 of households with incomes less than $100,000. She also proposed to eliminate tuition at public universities, and she had a way of funding her proposals. So her proposal, she wanted to create an ultra-millionaire tax, so 2% annual tax on household assets above $50 million, and an additional 1% billionaire tax, surtax, among billionaires, and an exit tax on those who renounced their U.S. citizenship in retaliation, so people who tried to flee in order to not pay the tax. Let's see, and so now the Biden plan, his plan consisted of a graduated system in which borrowers making under $25,000 would pay nothing, those making over $25,000 would be paying about 5% of their income, and any remaining loan balances would be forgiven after 20 years and would not be taxed. In addition, he wanted debt cancellation for a national community service up to 5 years, and borrowers employed at borrowers who were employed at would receive 2 years of free community college based on federal state partnerships, with 75% of the costs paid for by the federal government. So kind of thinking of this state-federal partnership. And his plan was also the only one to address bankruptcy, in that it supported student debt discharge in bankruptcy. But more specifically, we saw in the spring of 2018, a letter was sent to the current Secretary of Education that had a very clear agenda. It said the federal student loan program disproportionately impacted students of color, and the current structure and actions of the department have failed to protect these borrowers. And then in early 2019, several senators, including now Vice President Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, put out a call for stakeholder input on how to address racial disparities in student debt. So the issue of student debt and the disproportionate burden faced by students of color pursuing their post-secondary education had reached policymakers, became a central point of the media, and had a major campaign issue during the presidential election. And more recently, and more relevant to this conference, was a central part of the CARES Act passed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as I said earlier, less than 2 months after we concluded our interviews, the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged the world. Having only recently connected with many of our respondents, we decided to check in on them between June and August of 2020, to hear how they were doing and understand how COVID and policy decisions related to student debt had interrupted their lives. So I'm going to conclude with my talk by sharing some insights from those interviews and the overall student debt policy environment. So the pandemic had been especially painful for Black Americans, who disproportionately suffered loss of life and livelihood, all while bearing witness to the brutal murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and countless others at the hands of the police. And still, the racial wealth gap continued to grow in the pandemic. Amid such pain, between Jason and I, we thought writing about racial wealth inequality and student debts felt almost trivial.